Arizona Territory, 1879. Naomi Hartley was 28 years old, and she had buried her father in April and lost 40 head of cattle to a flash flood in June. She had not cried at the funeral. She cried 3 weeks later, alone in the barn, over a busted water trough, because grief has a way of waiting for the moment you can least afford it. She ran 300 acres at the edge of the San Pedro Valley, with 2 hired hands who came and went depending on the season, and a mortgage at the Tucson bank that her father had signed the year before he died. She had never asked to run a ranch. She had only ever wanted to help run one, alongside a father who talked to his cattle like they understood him and who taught her to read brands before she could read books. Now the brands were hers to read alone, and half of them were gone, scattered somewhere across the flats after the wash flooded and broke through the fence line. The town of Contention had opinions about a woman running cattle by herself. Most of those opinions came wrapped in kindness that had teeth in it. The banker suggested she sell. The preacher suggested she remarry. Her neighbor, a rancher named Silas Grier, who had wanted her father's water rights for a decade, suggested she consider his offer before the bank made the decision for her. Naomi considered none of it. What she did was ride out to the trading post at Senaga Wells and ask for the one man everyone said could find anything that walked or crawled across that country, a tracker named Tazhi. She had heard about him the way you hear about most things in a small territory, secondhand and half-true. He worked sometimes for the cavalry out of Fort Lowell, scouting for patrols that watched the roads between the reservation at San Carlos and the settlements. He worked sometimes for ranchers who had lost stock to weather or to thieves, and he was paid in coin when there was coin and in trade goods when there was not. He was Chiricahua Apache in his early 30s, and he had a wife who had died of fever 2 winters back and no children living, which the post owner mentioned like it explained something about the quiet way he carried himself. "I need my cattle found," Naomi told him, standing in the yard of the trading post with dust still on her boots from the ride. "I can pay $4 and feed for the horse." Tazhi looked at her for a long moment before he answered. 40 head is a lot of ground to cover for $4. "It's what I have." He studied her the way he studied a hoof print, without hurry, reading something she couldn't guess at. "I'll find them," he said. "Not for the $4, because your father once let my sister's family water their horses on his land during a bad summer, and never once made it feel like charity." I want to pause here for just a moment, because this story has already found its way to people in Brazil, in Nigeria, in the Philippines, in South Africa, in places I never expected a story about the Arizona desert to travel to. If you're one of them, listening tonight for the first time, this channel is still young, and every person who stops to listen makes it a little less quiet in here. If this story is finding a place in you already, hit subscribe before you go anywhere else tonight. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to a small channel, trying to grow one honest story at a time. Now let's get back, because Naomi had just found the one person in the territory willing to help her for reasons that had nothing to do with money. They rode out at first light the next morning. Tazhi read the ground the way other men read a newspaper, unhurried and certain. He found the first sign within 2 hours, a place where the flood had pushed the herd east instead of scattering them, toward a dry wash that still held enough grass to keep cattle from wandering further. "They didn't scatter as bad as you thought," he said, crouched at the edge of a hoof-churned patch of mud. "Something held them together." "What?" "Rider," he said. "More than one, not chasing them apart, driving them somewhere." Naomi felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You mean someone took them?" "I mean someone's herding 40 head of another man's cattle toward the Grier line and doing it in a hurry." The historical reality of the San Pedro Valley in 1879 made that sentence land harder than it might have elsewhere. Cattle theft in the territory carried real weight, both economic and legal, and small operations without the money for a full crew of riders were the easiest targets in the district. A woman running a ranch alone, with a mortgage coming due, and a neighbor who wanted her water rights, was about as easy a target as existed in that stretch of Arizona. They followed the drive for 2 days. Tazhi read water and grass and worn grass and broken brush with a patience that made Naomi feel, for the first time since her father died, like someone else was carrying part of the weight. They spoke very little those first 2 days, the kind of quiet that comes from two people working toward the same goal without needing to fill the silence with talk. It was the second night, camped near a spring with the cattle sign fresh enough that Tazhi said they'd catch up by noon the next day, that the quiet broke a little. "Your father," Tazhi said, feeding the small fire. "What was he like?" "Stubborn," Naomi said. "Generous in ways that made my mother furious. He'd give away half the harvest to a family that had a bad year and then wonder why we were tight on cash come winter. Sounds like a good man to owe a debt to." "Is that why you're here? A debt?" Tazhi was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Partly," he said finally. "The rest is that I remember what it is to lose ground you didn't choose to lose. My people have been losing it for longer than either of us has been alive. I don't like watching it happen to someone who never did anything to deserve it, whatever color her skin is. This is the 4th story on this channel, and if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribing and leaving a like genuinely helps a small channel find its footing. I'd love to know, in the comments, where you're listening from tonight and what you're doing while you listen. I read every one of them, and I like knowing this story is traveling further than I ever imagined it could. Now let's get back to that fire, because Naomi was about to ask the question that had been sitting in her chest since Seneca Wells. "Why do the ranchers trust you to track their stock?" she asked, "when half the territory doesn't trust your people at all?" "Because finding cattle is simple work," Tazhi said. "Trust is not required for simple work, only skill." "That's not an answer." "No," he admitted. "It's not." He looked at the fire instead of at her. "The honest answer is that most of them don't trust me. They tolerate me because I'm useful, the same way they tolerate the weather. I've made peace with being useful instead of trusted. It's a smaller thing to want and easier to get." Naomi didn't know what to say to that, so she said the truest thing she had. "I trust you. You needed your cattle found. That's not why." He looked at her then, and something in his face shifted, careful and searching, like a man deciding whether to believe what he'd just heard. He didn't say anything else that night, but he banked the fire a little closer to her side of camp before he settled into sleep, and Naomi noticed and didn't mention it, and lay awake longer than she meant to, listening to the desert settle around them. They caught up to the herd the next afternoon, exactly where Tazhi said they would, in a box canyon on the edge of Grier land, where 2 of Silas Grier's hired hands were finishing the job of rebranding the last of the calves. Tazhi didn't ride in armed for a fight. He rode in slow, hands visible, and let the 2 hands see him clearly before he spoke. "You're on the wrong side of the boundary line with someone else's cattle," he said, calm as a man discussing weather. "I'd start moving them back toward the Hartley fence before I have to explain to Fort Lowell why I found stolen stock on Grier land." One of the hands reached for his rifle. The other put a hand on his arm and stopped him. "He ain't wrong about Fort Lowell," the second man muttered. "Grier said this'd be quiet. Ain't nothing quiet about a cavalry inquiry." They didn't fight. They didn't need to. Word of a scout working with the cavalry carried its own weight in that country, and neither hand wanted his name attached to a rustling charge that a Fort investigation would surface within a week. They moved the cattle back across the line themselves, muttering the whole way, and rode off toward the Grier ranch house to explain to their employer why the job had gone sideways. Naomi stood at the fence line afterward, watching her cattle drift back onto her own land, and found she couldn't speak for a moment. 40 head, Tazhi said. "All of them." "You knew," she said. "You knew it was Grier before we even started." "I suspected. The flood pushed your herd east toward his fence line, and a man who's wanted your water for 10 years doesn't need much of an excuse to help a flood, along with a few extra riders and a rebranding iron." "Why didn't you tell me at Seneca Wells?" "Because suspicion isn't proof, and I don't accuse a man of theft on a guess. I needed to see the brand work myself." He looked at her. "Now I have." Silas Grier came to see Naomi 3 days later, not to apologize, since men like Grier rarely apologized for anything, but to renew his offer to buy her out, this time with a warning wrapped inside it about how dangerous it was for a woman alone to be running cattle in country full of thieves and worse. "I don't need protecting from thieves I've already caught," Naomi told him, standing on her own porch with her arms crossed. "And I don't need your offer. Not this year, not next year." Grier's jaw tightened. "You'll change your mind when the bank calls that note due." "Maybe," Naomi said, "but it won't be to you." He left angry, the way men like Grier always left when a woman didn't do what they expected. And Naomi stood on the porch a long time after his wagon disappeared down the road, feeling something she hadn't felt since before her father died. Not safety, exactly. Something closer to ground under her feet that she'd chosen to stand on herself. Grier did not let it rest there. 2 weeks later, a lieutenant from Fort Lowell rode out to the Hartley place with a summons for Tazhi on a complaint filed by Silas Grier, claiming the scout had threatened his hired hands with violence and stolen cattle bearing the Grier brand off Grier land. Naomi rode to the fort herself the day she heard, arriving dust-covered and furious, and asked to speak to the post commander directly. She was made to wait 2 hours in an anteroom before a captain named Whitfield agreed to see her, and when he did, he listened with the polite, distracted patience of a man who had already decided how the matter would end before she opened her mouth. "Mr. Grier's complaint is a serious one," Captain Whitfield said. "Threats against armed men, cattle taken across a property line. If even part of it holds up, your tracker loses his contract with this fort, and likely worse. Your tracker recovered stolen cattle that Grier's own hands were caught rebranding in a box canyon," Naomi said. "I was there. I watched it happen." "You're not exactly a disinterested witness, Miss Hartley. Neither is Silas Grier, who's wanted my water rights for 10 years and has been trying to buy me out since my father died. Ask around contention who's more likely to be lying to you." Whitfield's patience thinned. "I'll conduct my own inquiry. In the meantime, the scout will report here to answer the complaint, and I'd advise you both to consider how this looks. A rancher and an Apache scout so quick to defend one another." The historical weight behind that threat was not small. In the years surrounding the height of tension with Chiricahua bands in the territory, Army scouts who lost the trust of a post commander could lose their livelihood entirely, and sometimes their freedom, on the word of a rancher with the right friends in Tucson. Silas Grier had those friends. He had spent a decade cultivating them, the same way he'd spent a decade trying to buy Hartley land and Hartley water. Tazhi rode to the fort 3 days later, alone, refusing Naomi's offer to come with him. "It'll look worse if you're there," he told her, tightening the cinch on his saddle in the gray dawn light. "A woman standing beside her tracker looks like exactly what Grier wants Whitfield to see. Let me answer for myself. And if they don't believe you, then they don't believe me. It won't be the first time. I've survived being disbelieved before." He swung up onto his horse. "What I haven't survived, and don't intend to start now, is staying quiet when I know I did nothing wrong." Naomi spent that day pacing her own porch raw, unable to settle to any chore, watching the road east for a rider who didn't come until well past dark. When he finally did, riding in slow and tired under a sky gone full of stars, she ran to meet him before he'd even swung down. "Well?" "Whitfield questioned me for 3 hours," Tazhi said. "Then he sent a rider to the box canyon to check the ground himself. Brand irons don't lie, even 3 weeks old. He found Grier's rebranding tools still cached in a rock crevice, not 200 yards from where his hands were caught working." "So he believes you. He believes the ground. That's usually enough, if a man's willing to look at it honestly." Tazhi allowed himself something close to a smile, tired and worn, but real. "Grier's complaint is dismissed. My contract stands, and Whitfield had a few sharp words for Mr. Grier about wasting a cavalry inquiry on a grudge. Naomi let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 days straight. "It shouldn't have to be this hard," she said. "You shouldn't have had to ride out there alone and prove your whole character over 40 head of cattle that were never his to begin with." "No," Tazhi agreed quietly. "It shouldn't. But it is, and it likely will be again, for me and men like me, for longer than either of us will live to see fixed. I've made my peace with fighting battles that shouldn't exist in the first place. It's the only way I know to keep standing in ground that keeps trying to shift out from under my feet." She reached for his hand then, the first time she'd done it without a reason, like fear or gratitude behind it, simply because she wanted to, and he let her take it, and neither of them said anything else about Grier or Whitfield or Fort inquiries for the rest of that night. Tazhi kept coming back after that. Not often, and never with an excuse that pretended to be about anything but what it was. He'd ride out when he had a few days between cavalry work, and he'd mend a section of fence, or help gather stock before a storm, or simply sit with her on the porch in the evening while the light went gold over the valley, and neither of them felt any need to fill the quiet with talk. The town noticed, the way small towns always notice, and the opinions came the way they always come, wrapped in concern that had teeth in it. A woman alone with an Apache scout riding out to see her regular as clockwork was, in the eyes of contention, a scandal waiting for a name. Naomi heard the whispers at the mercantile and said nothing back, because she had learned by then that the people whispering had never once ridden 2 days through open country to catch a man stealing 40 head of another person's cattle, and their opinions carried about as much weight as that fact suggested. The clearest test of it came at the harvest dance that fall, held in the same barn where half the county had celebrated weddings and mourned funerals for as long as contention had existed. Naomi went because her father had never missed one, and because she was tired of letting Silas Grier and his allies decide which rooms she was welcome in. She did not expect Tazhi to come, and told him so plainly. "You don't have to prove anything to that barn full of people," she said the week before, mending a shirt on her porch while he oiled a saddle strap beside her. "I'm not going for them," he said. "If I go, it's because I'd like one evening where I'm not choosing between the fort, the trading post, and a fire out on the range by myself. I'm tired, same as you are, of only having half a life to live in." He came. The barn went quiet when he walked in beside her, the particular quiet of a room recalculating what it thought it knew, and it took the length of 2 full songs before conversation picked back up around them, thinner than before, careful in a way that hadn't been there when Naomi walked in alone the year before. Not everyone recovered their manners. A rancher's wife named Constance Pruitt made a point of steering her daughters to the far side of the barn the moment Tazhi crossed the floor to bring Naomi a cup of punch, and old Deacon Hollis stood near the door the whole night with his arms folded, watching the two of them the way a man watches weather he doesn't trust. Naomi felt every one of those looks land somewhere under her ribs and clenched her jaw and kept dancing anyway, because giving Constance Pruitt the satisfaction of driving her out of her own father's barn was a defeat she refused to hand over for free. It was Tazhi who nearly left first, near the end of the night, standing near the barn door with his hat back in his hands, the way it went whenever he was working through something difficult. "I shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "It puts a target on you that wasn't there before tonight." "The target's been there since the day you rode out to find my cattle," Naomi said. "Tonight just made it visible to people too polite to say it to my face before. That's not a comfort. It wasn't meant to be one. It was meant to be true." She took his hand, right there in the barn doorway, in plain sight of Deacon Hollis and anyone else still watching. "I'd rather have a visible target and you standing next to me than a quiet reputation and an empty porch every evening. I made that choice a long time before tonight, Tazhi. This dance didn't change it. It just let the rest of contention catch up to something I already knew." They walked out together, and if Deacon Hollis had anything to say about it, He kept it behind his folded arms and said nothing at all, which was, Naomi thought on the ride home, about as close to acceptance as a man like that was ever likely to offer. It was Tazhi who brought it up first, on a spring evening a year after the flood, sitting on the porch steps with his hat in his hands, turning it over slowly the way he did when he was working up to something difficult. "People are talking," he said. "People always talk. About us." Naomi set down the mending in her lap. "I know. It's not easy," he said. "What people would say if this became something more than a man who comes to help with fences." "I know that too. I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't a risk." "I know, Tazhi." She said his name the way she'd started saying it these last months, easy and familiar, like a word she'd always known. "I've buried a father, lost my herd, and stood up to Silas Grier on my own porch. I think I can survive people talking." He was quiet a moment, turning the hat once more in his hands before he set it aside entirely. "My people have reason to distrust promises made across this kind of line," he said. "The government has made enough of them and broken everyone. I won't make you a promise I'm not certain I can keep, with the reservation policy the way it is, with the patrols the way they are. I don't know what the next 5 years hold for my people, or for me." "Then don't promise me 5 years," Naomi said. "Promise me this season. We'll figure out the next one when it comes." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face eased, like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying without meaning to. "I can promise a season," he said. "I've never been able to promise more than that, about anything, but a season I can give you." Neither of them said the rest of it out loud that night, the thing that had been building quietly since a fire at a desert spring a year before. It stayed in the space between them, in the way his hand found hers on the porch step, in the way she leaned her shoulder against his, and neither of them moved away. Some things don't need to be spoken to be true. They only need to be there, steady, the way the mountains were steady at the edge of the valley, the way the water was steady in the spring that never ran dry, even in the worst drought years. The winter that followed was hard, colder than the valley had seen in years, and Tazhi spent more of it at the Hartley Ranch than at the trading post or the fort, helping Naomi keep stock alive through weeks when the wind cut through every seam in a coat and the cattle needed watching around the clock. The town of Contention had long since stopped whispering by then, not because they'd made peace with it, but because a rancher who'd survived a flood, a theft, and 2 winters without losing a single head of cattle had earned a kind of grudging respect that outlasted gossip. 3 years after that first ride to Cienega Wells, Naomi Hartley stood on the same porch, older now, with more gray creeping into hair she still wore, pulled back the way her mother had, and watched Tazhi ride in from a 2-day patrol with the cavalry, tired and dust-covered, and smiling the particular smile he saved only for coming home. The ranch had grown by then, water rights secured, the mortgage long since paid off with 3 good seasons of beef prices that finally broke in her favor. Silas Grier had sold his own operation 2 years back and moved east, tired of a fight he'd never once managed to win against a woman who wouldn't sell and wouldn't scare. Captain Whitfield had been reassigned to a post in New Mexico Territory the year after the inquiry, and his replacement at Fort Lowell had never once questioned Tazhi's word again, not after the story of the rebranding irons had made its way around the officer's mess as a lesson in checking ground before believing a complaint. Contention itself had changed too, slowly, the way small towns change when nobody's watching closely enough to name the moment it happened. Constance Pruitt's own daughter had married a drifter of no particular fortune 2 summers back, over her mother's loud objections, and the whole affair had softened Constance considerably on the subject of who a person was allowed to love. Even Deacon Hollis, older now and slower on his feet, had taken to nodding at Tazhi across the mercantile without folding his arms first, which was as close to an apology as the old man had in him. Tazhi swung down from his horse, and Naomi crossed the yard to meet him the way she had every time he rode in for 3 years running, and if anyone in contention still had opinions about it, neither of them had heard one in a long while. That evening, after supper, they sat together on the same porch steps where he had once turned his hat over in his hands, working up to a promise he hadn't been sure he could keep. The valley had gone the particular gold it went every evening in late summer, the mountains darkening at the edges, while the flats still held the last of the light. And Naomi found herself thinking, not for the first time, of the fire at that first desert spring, and the 2 days of near silence that had somehow said more than either of them managed to say out loud for months afterward. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never trying at all?" she asked. "If Grier hadn't stolen my cattle. If you'd said no at Senega Wells." "I think about it," Tazhi admitted. "Mostly, I think about how little any of it would have mattered if I'd said no. You'd have found another way to get your herd back. You were already halfway to fighting Grier on your own before I ever rode out with you." "Maybe, but I don't think I'd have found this." She gestured, not at anything in particular, just the whole of it, the porch and the valley, and the man beside her who'd once promised her nothing more than a season and had somehow made good on far more than that. "A debt repaid is one thing. This is something else." "It is," he agreed. He was quiet a moment, watching the light fade over the San Pedro. "My grandmother used to say a good tracker doesn't follow sign because he knows exactly where it leads. He follows it because he trusts that the ground will keep telling the truth, step after step, longer than any man's doubt can outlast it." I didn't understand what she meant until I was well past 30, sitting on a porch I had no right expecting to still be welcome on. "You were always welcome here, Tazhi, even the nights you didn't believe it yourself." He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had in the barn doorway years before, in plain sight of anyone who cared to look, though there was no one left in contention who bothered anymore. 40 head, he said, echoing the words from that first canyon, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to make her smile. "All of them, safe." "All of them," she agreed, "and a season that turned into a lot more seasons than either of us promised." "I told you I could only promise one at a time." "You did." She took his hand, weathered now the same way hers had gone, both of them marked by a decade of ranch work neither one regretted. "Turns out that was enough, one season at a time, for longer than I thought anything could last in this country. I think about that a lot, the way the biggest things in a life rarely arrive with any promise attached to them at all. Nobody offers you 40 years up front. Nobody offers you certainty about a reservation policy or a drought, or whether the next season's cattle prices will hold. All anyone can honestly offer is the next season, and the one after that, built one at a time out of showing up when it matters and staying when it would be easier to leave." Naomi never did get the guarantee she might have wanted at the start, the kind the town would have approved of, tidy and certain and free of risk. What she got instead was a man who kept his word one season at a time, for longer than either of them had dared to promise, and a piece of ground that was still hers, still growing, still watered by a spring that never ran dry, even in the hardest years. Some debts get repaid in cattle found and fences mended. The rarer ones get repaid in a life built slowly, season by season, by two people who never needed more than that to call it enough.